All right, good afternoon, everyone. Without further ado, and in the interest of time, this is our short session, so I don't want to eat into valuable minutes. But thank you again to those of you who may have just arrived, and to all of you who have stayed on through the day. Thanks again for being here. I'm really, really delighted to welcome two good friends and esteemed experts on all the many issues we've discussed today to the Middle East Institute and to this panel. Starting off, of course, with Joshua Geltzer, Deputy Assistant to the President and the Deputy National Security Advisor at the NSC. Josh, absolutely thrilled to have you here. Thank you again for taking the time. And joining him on the stage, another good friend, Peter Bergen, National Security Analyst at CNN and the Vice President for Global Studies at New America. Without further ado, we're going to have essentially a 25-30 minute conversation between these two. There won't be audience questions for this session, but I think there will be a lot to take away from the conversation that we'll be hearing very shortly. So without further ado, over to you two. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Charles, and thank you, MEI and ISCR for organizing this. I've known Josh since he was doing his PhD at King's College on the question of the strategy against Al-Qaeda, which became this book, an important collector's item at this point, U.S. counterterrorism strategy and Al-Qaeda. And of course, Josh went on to become Senior Director for Counterterrorism, the NSC, not only under the Obama administration, but he was also held over, one of the very few people that was held over by the Trump administration for 4 months at the beginning of the Trump administration. So Josh has spent his entire life thinking about strategy against terrorist groups. He also was a professor at Georgetown Law School before he took up his job at the White House. And so, Josh, I guess the first question is, where is ISIS right now? I mean, because, I think for a lot of people, it's a problem that seems to be either solved or forgotten or gone or something. So what is the state of play?
Thank you, Peter. And let me just start by thanking you, Charles, MEI, all those who helped bring this event together. Really an honor to get to be here with all of you. Though I was worried when I saw Peter take this book out. I was worrying he wanted his money back after all these years on it, which I'm not sure I can afford. But Peter's been a great friend for a while now, not to mention someone from whom I think all of us continue to learn on these and so many issues. So really a privilege to get to have this conversation with you. So I think you're starting in exactly the place I hope to start, which is to emphasize that ISIS is none of those things. It is not gone. It is instead very much in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere still a threat to countries where it continues to have a presence, which is about 30 countries worldwide. It is still a threat to the region, Iraq, Syria, and neighbors. And it is still a threat to the United States and our allies and partners. And I know we'll get into a bit of a conversation on how our strategy, the US strategy, has evolved and continues to evolve. But I would emphasize that in a sense, ISIS's strategy remains relatively consistent. In other words, ISIS, and especially ISIS in Iraq and Syria, continues to try to do a few things we have seen them try to do since they emerged. That includes taking advantage of ungoverned or insufficiently governed spaces to recruit and radicalize and plot attacks. It includes trying to foment instability and division, in part because that can create a lack of governance that they can take advantage of. And of course, it includes trying to carry out terrorist attacks and indeed to exert control over territory where ISIS can. Now, thankfully, due to the efforts of the US and a much broader coalition, that level of territorial control in Iraq and Syria is not what it once was. But that basic strategy remains the approach of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and at times with lethal effect. In the first half of this year alone, the first half of 2022, ISIS has taken credit, at least, for about 350 attacks in Iraq and Syria. Again, that's their own taking credit, but even if you discount that by some number, that is a very active terrorist entity, and indeed one that continues to take lives. And I'll say just one more thing, because we sit here almost exactly 1 year to the day since a particularly devastating attack that took at least 30 lives in Baghdad last July 19. And that was the second suicide bombing by ISIS in Baghdad in roughly the first half of last year. So all of that speaks to an entity that we continue to be concerned about because it merits that concern.
You mentioned the 30 countries. So I know we're mostly focused on Iraq and Syria, but to the extent, I mean, it looks like ISIS in Africa is having sort of a resurgence. ISIS, according to the UN, ISIS in Afghanistan has gone from 2,000 to 4,000. Do you have a sense of what kind of threat these sort of regional affiliates pose, and B, the extent to which they're being controlled, if at all, by ISIS Central?
And this, frankly, is another piece of ISIS's strategy that has been relatively consistent, which is to try to generate not just a presence in Iraq and Syria, but as you rightly say, Peter, to generate as global a presence and then build on and expand that presence as they are able, in particular, homing in on spaces where either a lack of or insufficient governance makes that more possible for them to achieve. I'd say that the networks and the branches that account for that presence in 30-ish countries, it differs in the numbers, it differs in the severity, it differs in the attacks and their lethality that they're able to pull off. But both in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, I think we do see that which concerns the US government about terrorist groups generally, which is not only the ultimate bad outcome, which is loss of life because of terrorist attacks, but to your point, Peter, some coordination on the recruitment, the propaganda put out online and otherwise to try to swell and grow those ranks. We do see financial movements, ISIS trying to use those parts of the globe where they are able to generate more money and push those to branches and networks that may have less. And to some extent, to keep, as they have always tried to keep, some overarching approach, even while delegating downward particular operational planning, some overarching attack and broader strategy. And here I would just emphasize that earlier this year, ISIS launched one of its periodic global campaigns, where in a multi-week period, they tried to even ratchet up further the lethality of their attacks and the frequency of those attacks worldwide. And the branches and the networks responded to that with an uptick in the number of attacks.
When was that?
That was a couple months ago. It was earlier this year. And I think it demonstrates that there is a level of coordination and collaboration among those at times disparate branches.
And the US troops that were put into Somalia, I think there was 500 or so, I can't remember the exact number, that is that anything to do with sort of concerns about ISIS, or is that unrelated?
I'll say two things. The persistent presence that this administration has approved in Somalia, rather than the rotational presence of US troops that the outgoing administration moved to at the very end, that is really focused on a Shabab threat that concerns us. At the same time, and this is the second point, ISIS in Somalia, ISIS in that part of Africa also does concern us. And ISIS more broadly across the African continent really does concern us in the numbers of fighters they're able to attract, the level of lethality they're able to achieve, and based on those things, their desire to recruit and radicalize and mobilize further, including taking advantage of what are unfortunately too many ungoverned or inadequately governed spaces that give them the type of safe haven that ISIS looks for.
Yesterday's drone attack that killed 2 senior ISIS leaders, and then the attack in early February that killed the leader of ISIS. I mean, to what extent do you fall personally, and just on the question of decapitation as sort of, obviously if you take out one person, there's usually a successor. If it's a campaign where you decapitate a lot of people and take out all the middle management, that can really impact the group. So is there kind of a disconnect by saying that ISIS is, still out there and still an organization that's functional, with the fact that you are actually clearly killing quite a number of their leadership?
So here's what I'd say to that. We think of those sorts of operations as critical but also not in and of themselves our current strategy. Our current strategy is much broader than that. So we do think it's essential to rely on the intelligence community and others to generate the sort of quite exquisite intelligence that can enable the sort of operation that occurred earlier this week, that occurred back in February, because degrading that leadership level and eliminating those whose distinctive expertise, experience, connectivity, ability to inspire, that can diminish the ability of ISIS to focus on what it wants to focus on, gaining more territorial control, engaging in more attacks, recruiting further. At the same time, that is just one piece. It's embedded in a broader strategy. And in a sense, the current phase of our counter-ISIS strategy, and especially our counter-ISIS strategy in Iraq and Syria, includes that component, but emphasizes what we tend to call some of the non-kinetic components particularly strongly. That includes trying to invest in and operationalize the sort of stabilization that can prevent ISIS from taking hold, generating safe haven in the first place. It can include trying to disrupt the sort of financial flows that I mentioned earlier. It can include trying to prevent ISIS from being able to recruit and radicalize essentially a next generation, especially in the displaced persons camps, which offer, in a sense, such terrible, in humanitarian terms, terrible conditions, but ones that ISIS finds appealing to try to recruit and radicalize. That's why we invest in educational curricula and basic nutritional needs and other things.
Are they succeeding with those efforts in the camps?
I think ISIS continues to invest in trying to do that. They see a population that is sadly in quite difficult conditions, and they see that as an opportunity to try to recruit and radicalize.
And then that becomes a problem for repatriation, right?
It becomes a problem for repatriation and more broadly, frankly. I mean, first of all, it's just a humanitarian problem day to day. Those who are in those displaced persons camps, despite heavy investment by the US government, investment by other key partners, investment that we continue to encourage from those partners and from multilateral institutions. Despite that, these are very challenging conditions to be in. So I do think it creates, most palpably, in a sense, most immediately, a humanitarian problem, but it also creates other problems. A problem for those governments that, despite our encouragement, despite, in a sense, some collective commitments by the coalition to work on this issue, that can become more reluctant to bring back, to repatriate those whom they worry might pose a problem in their home countries. That said, I think we owe credit to those countries that do continue to work toward that. We saw France just a couple of weeks ago bring back about 50, I think 51 individuals. And we continue to work with our partners to enable and to encourage, in a sense, two sets of things. One, those who were actually part of ISIS's violence and can be brought to justice in their home countries doing so. And two, those who are part of the extraordinary human suffering that ISIS generated and continues to generate, albeit at a lower scale, trying to repatriate those and reintegrate them into life in their home countries.
Are you seeing any, once ISIS lost its physical caliphate, the kind of appeal of the group really crashed, not only in the United States, but the countries around the world. If ISIS is reviving, which are you saying it's reviving, or what is the verb that you're using?
I guess I'd say it's working hard to revive itself. We're working hard to prevent that, and that's an active dynamic.
Do you see anybody coming to Iraq and Syria from outside to join the group, or is it zero as far as we can tell?
I would hesitate to claim that it's zero, but I would say it is not right now the foreign fighter flow that we saw at the peak of its exercise of purported territorial control in Iraq and Syria. And we as a government, along with partners, invested heavily in trying to disrupt that flow, as you know, both by using law enforcement tools, by using intelligence sharing, by counter messaging, and by trying to raise up and amplify credible voices who could say to those who might consider going, why it's a false promise being held up by ISIS. And so the point I'd make is that effort continues. Some of what we built then to have intel sharing with our partners, including through law enforcement channels, to try to amplify those voices that might discourage or at least cause those who would otherwise be drawn to ISIS to think twice about it. We continue to invest in those efforts because we think we have to. At the same time, the numbers are not what they were then, and I think it's our collective responsibility to do what we can to keep it that way.
When Timothy Betts was speaking to Eric Schmidt, he used the number that the United States has taken 39 folks back from Syria. What are the mechanisms in place to make sure that these people aren't recidivists, or, I mean, are they generally facing a prosecution? What has happened to them?
So it won't surprise you that the answer is a little bit different. It's sort of individualized, but obviously those whom our law enforcement thinks violated U.S. law, there can be an appetite to hold them accountable, as well it should be. Then there are others who may have been caught up in what were obviously appalling conditions there, for whom repatriation involves reintegrating them, but there are not, so far as we know, things to hold them accountable for. At the same time, we obviously want to be responsible at that. We do not want to bring people in this context or any other context into our country in a way that poses a threat to American communities. So I think State Department works closely, Tim's team and others, with those across the government who try to discern which is which in those rough categories, and to try to do so in a way that makes good on our own responsibility, along with our partners, to try to deal with the magnitude of the population that remains in Iraq and Syria, both on the detention facility side of the house, those who are being held as detainees because they are regarded as having engaged in ISIS's violence or otherwise responsible for what ISIS has done, and those who are seen more as displaced persons caught up in the humanitarian catastrophe.
And so Iraq has taken 2,400 plus back, and Kazakhstan apparently has taken 600. I mean, is there any evidence of recidivism, or are these mostly just the sort of pre-screening process that make that much less likely, or what?
I am not aware of some dramatic scale of recidivism, and I think that's in part because the efforts by the U.S. government and our partners have been deliberate in the way you suggest, have been deliberate in trying to ensure that those who are brought back carefully and thoughtfully, and with an eye towards protecting communities wherever they are returning to. That's important. At the same time, it is important to kind of ratchet up the speed at which we're doing this, because the numbers are quite extraordinary, and dealing with the problem that you all have been hearing about today, and that's been surfaced by these important conversations, is going to take that. Addressing that is going to take doing this at a pace beyond what's occurring thus far.
And 30,000 or roughly of these people are children.
Which I think speaks to, in some ways, the point I was trying to emphasize before, which is, for all the security considerations, for all the very important need to work carefully with partners, there is just a appalling humanitarian situation occurring, and one we are trying to mitigate as best we can, meeting basic nutrition needs, providing stabilization, avoiding violence, offering educational curricula, supporting the distribution of textbooks. And at the same time, this is not how we want to see children growing up, and we and our partners are trying to work to address it.
I mean, and how do you deal with a situation where, these kids are presumed, some of their parents are pretty radicalized? I mean, is there a family separation issue? How do you?
It's hard. If it weren't hard, Charles wouldn't have brought us all together for a couple days to work through it. But these are the right questions, Peter, the ones we ask ourselves. And the answer is, I think, at some level, get individualized, which is why this isn't being and can't be done en masse, because calibrating what it means to try to repatriate those who are from countries in which they're not currently located, and at the same time do so in a way that's responsible with respect to them, their familial connections, responsible with respect to basic humanity, responsible with respect to the communities they might join, including, as you say, those who would travel with them. That requires some pretty careful and at times very granular consideration.
And do you, the ISIS that exists now, what are its capabilities, do you think? Because with as much specificity as possible, because the previous talk mentioned targeting bomb makers and financiers, and I mean, is this purely a local group with purely local abilities with maybe larger aspirations, or is it a local group that plans to spread terrorism to the region or the West, or what is it actually capable of?
So I guess I'd say a few things. First, it is a group that, at least in small pockets right now, continues to exercise, or at least attempt to exercise, some territorial control in Iraq and Syria. Where it is able to, it is eager to do that and tries to seize on opportunities to do that. Second, it is a group that has networks within Iraq and Syria that are able to generate and operationalize terrorist attacks that take lives. Again, I know the 350 number I mentioned are claimed attacks, but even if you pare that down, the number that are in fact documented attacks in the first 6 months of this year is too high, not to mention those particularly notable attacks like the one almost exactly a year ago that takes lives in a place like Baghdad. So it is an entity in Iraq and Syria still able to execute attacks. And then we have no doubt that it has the aspiration to engage in the sort of external operations that it was engaged in at its peak. Operations, of course, in France, in Belgium, but also operations, at least via inspiration, that occurred here in the United States. And even as, and you said this before, Peter, and it's spot on, even as the appeal of the group's message, its reach, even its basic output online, has to some extent diminished in a way that roughly correlates with its territorial control in Iraq and Syria, it has not gone away, just as its efforts to exert territorial control have not gone away. And ISIS continues to try to inspire attacks, places like here and elsewhere. And it does continue to harbor at least the intent to reach beyond Iraq, Syria, and carry out attacks elsewhere. And that's really speaking only to ISIS in Iraq and Syria. When we zoom out and talk about those 30 branches and networks globally, those, especially some of those branches and networks, are carrying out attacks. ISIS-K in Afghanistan, ISIS branches in Africa, and they are showing their own operational capacity that is lethal.
You remember the ISIS-inspired attack by the Uzbek American in Manhattan around Halloween, I think of 2017. Yeah, were you still in the White House then?
No, I had left.
You just left.
It was Saipov.
Yeah. But so, I mean, that was after the caliphate had more or less collapsed, I mean, geographically. Right. So are you seeing any evidence of that in the United States, in the West, that it remains a potent inspirational force, or is it sort of like, hey, well, they lost and it's less?
I wish it were the latter, but I think we worry about it as something closer to the former. And you hear this when Director Wray is on the Hill for testimony, or other administration officials testify about how we see threats globally, and especially how we see threats to the homeland. And we still consider those whom we term HVEs, homegrown violent extremists, which means those who are located here but inspired by international terrorists, especially foreign terrorist organizations. We still see that as a very real threat. And as Director Wray has indicated, and the Attorney General has indicated, that remains something that leads to law enforcement resources needing to be devoted to it. It generates investigations and prosecutions, as the public sees from time to time. And even as we have a broad array of threats to the homeland, including domestic terrorist threats that we are tackling right now, we don't see this threat as having gone away. And we still continue to worry about those whom ISIS and others like Al-Qaeda and its affiliates are able to inspire here on the homeland.
There's been a fair amount of discussion about the Turkish potential military incursion. What would it look like, do you think? I know it's hard to speculate about exactly, but I mean, what are their goals, and what is the timeline that they are indicating, and how interfering would it be with the things that you're concerned about?
I think I'll probably start with the last piece of it, which is it would be quite an interference. The U.S. government has conveyed to the Turkish government at very senior levels that we think the right answer to your first couple of questions is no operation. This is not how we think countries should operate, and we've communicated that at quite senior levels. One of the reasons for doing so is because we have seen in the past that those sorts of operations pull away some of our key partners in the counter-ISIS effort. And that effort is challenging enough, hard enough, and remains severe enough as is. It doesn't need to be made even more complex and challenging. So our view is that there should not be such an operation, and we've communicated that.
And what's their reaction?
I guess I'll leave that to the diplomatic conversations, but I would just emphasize that we think it is not the way that the church should proceed. And one of the reasons for that is precisely this negative consequence, which is the negative implications for counter-ISIS operations.
You remember the breaking the walls, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, kind of like, basically ISIS is ISIS because they got, did all these prison breaks. Can you reflect a little bit on the Osaka attack and kind of who was there, what happened?
In a sense, this goes back to where we started, Peter, which is some of the threads of continuity from ISIS, because trying to break out of prison detention facilities those whom they want to replenish their ranks with, that has been something this group and even its sort of predecessor has really emphasized for a number of years now. And Dana said this quite well when she was up here in the last conversation, given the speed at which the ISIS's so-called caliphate collapsed, thanks to years of pressure by the US and the broader coalition, the detainees who are being held primarily by our partners are often being held in facilities not built for this purpose. Facilities, buildings that were built for other things that, to their credit, our partners on the ground have tried their best to adapt to these purposes, both to hold ISIS detainees humanely, but also securely. That's very challenging given the numbers. It's very challenging given the number both of detainees and of locations at which they're trying to do this. And of course, it's particularly challenging given how much ISIS remains willing to invest of its own resources, its own personnel, its own energy in trying to break out those whom they want to replenish their ranks with. So it is something that we regard as a pretty high priority to resist. It is something we continue to work with our partners on the ground to resist, but it's going to remain an ongoing challenge because it is baked into their strategy.
Well, I mean, did this, from ISIS' point of view, was this a success or a failure? I mean, it seems that it was a several-day long battle with US and Syrian democratic forces, but they didn't, I mean, not that many people escaped, relatively speaking. I've seen publicly there were 3,000 prisoners. So how would you sort of assess it as a success, failure, what?
I guess I'd say this. I think it's to the credit of our SDF partners and to the credit of the US forces that supported and facilitated them that it was not worse. And that's because they worked hard to react to it, but they also took casualties in doing so, as they do in so many operations that, in a sense, benefit global security by trying to keep ISIS in check. So I do think the SDF and our own colleagues across the government and partners deserve credit for it not being worse than it was. At the same time, I don't want to see any ISIS detainee back on the battlefield and back in the fight. And I'm sure the SDF and others who need to deal with that as a reality on the ground don't want to see it either. So on the one hand, it could have been worse, and it took a response and courage and bravery and some losses to keep it from being worse. But we don't want to see that sort of thing happen. That's part of why you see the sort of disruptions that you saw earlier this week with intelligence-enabled US operations to try to eliminate key figures who, at least in some cases, may be part of the same networks that operationalize or oversee those sorts of prison break things. We want to try to keep those networks off balance, interrupt their plotting of various sorts, not only prison breaks, but obviously lethal attacks and other plotting, but in general, pressure them rather than allow them to have the time and space to plot and then execute those sorts of attacks. And
final question, and thank you for all your time, Josh, is, so what are you looking for from, obviously, the United States has an interest in this, and but relatively few Americans were there, are there. What are you looking for from the Iraqis, from European states? I mean, the British, you won't take anybody, it seems. What are you hoping for them to do?
So I'll start with Iraq. I mean, we continue to invest in working with our Iraqi partners to generate and augment the stability of Iraqi democracy. And we obviously regard the Iraqis and the Iraqi government as a critical partner on this front and in other ways. And frankly, I think the Iraqi counterterrorism forces deserve some credit for some pretty sophisticated operations they have pulled off over the past months in particular. So for them to stabilize their politics, remain a security partner, that's obviously critical. But zooming out, I think European partners and others, we want them to continue to invest and to escalate their investment in a few things. One, in ensuring that detention facilities are more secure, are more durable than the adapted ones that are currently being utilized in a lot of cases. Two, continue to take back those whom they are able to take back of their own nationality, whether that's to hold them accountable for crimes or whether that's to reintegrate those who have been caught up in the suffering. And three, I think, is to try to mitigate what are the current conditions for the displaced persons in these very large camps by joining us in investing heavily in nutritional needs and stabilization and education and all that which can make an extraordinarily difficult set of circumstances at least more humane and at least less susceptible to being exploited by ISIS for recruitment and radicalization of a next generation.
Well, thank you very much. The audience can thank us.